Just a quick announcement here. During the recording of this episode, multiple times, Patty's audio and video both cut out, especially during the tale about the Ingleby monster. I'm not sure whether it didn't want to be known or what, but please bear with us for this episode. It seemed to come and go, so we'll do our best when it comes to editing, but it is what it is. Hello and welcome to the Paranormalist Podcast. I am your co-host Stu, and I'm here with the paranormalist Patty Wilson. Patty, how are you today?
I am doing wonderfully. It is almost spring. I love this time of year. I know there's a little bit of a nip to the air, but it's okay.
It is a step
And
in the right direction.
I love this.
I was going to say it's a step in the right direction, and the day that we release this should be the first day of spring. So, but you know me, I'm still waiting the other 3 months for summer.
Yeah, I know you like the warm weather so well. But I'm anxious to plant. I do a lot of planting for those who are new. Do a big garden, and my grandchildren and I are doing some really cool experiments this year. We've already got our first one in the ground, and on
Hopefully, not
its way.
some macabre hybrid of something.
No, actually, every year I try to do some couple of things with them over the summer. So this year, I have a set of grandchildren who are twins, Brent and Autumn, and they're 7. So we took the tops of the carrots that we had for dinner the other night, and we put them in water and soaked them until they started to shoot up greens. And now they're in a flower pot and growing to see what will become of them. They're very excited, and they talk to them and make sure they water them, and I make sure they don't drown them. And it's our first experiment of spring.
Interesting. Hey, well, I have no segue for that, but I do want to say that we do appreciate all of you who are already subscribed. If you are first finding us, please do us the courtesy of clicking the like button and subscribe if you would like, please. And everything about the Paranormalist podcast will be in the description on whatever platform that you're listening or watching on. And with that, so what's our topic for today?
We are visiting the very first paranormal stories that colonials encountered when they came to America, and how these stories transformed from Native American legends and became part of the folklore for both the Native Americans and the colonials.
Okay.
So I obviously was dabbling in the beginnings of American history again. And I came across a story that took me down a rabbit hole. And anybody who knows me well will tell you that once I fall down a rabbit hole, I can't stop for a while. So I want to start with this story, and it's called The Rolling Head. It is a Native American story. It comes from upper part of Pennsylvania into the Finger Lakes of New York. It would be that region. And the story goes something like this. There was a Native American man and his wife who lived in a fairly isolated area, with a group of people, but on their own independently. They also had 2 small children. And one day the woman was out and she met this being, variously described as a snake man or a wild man. And I'm not really sure what that one means. But anyhow, she met this man, and she and this man began to communicate, and eventually she had relations with said man. And when her husband found out, he was furious and
Yeah.
pled her love for this being that was, as he believed, not mortal. And so he attacked her, and there was a scuffle and a fight, and he murdered her and cut her head off.
Ooh.
And it is said that after this, that her head would go rolling through the wilderness. It had chased him down on many occasions, and even his children, and that his children would have to use magic in order to get away from the rolling head of their mother. One of them threw a comb into the ground and yelled for help from the gods in the sky, and a great big briar patch arose, and the other one, he was begging for help, and he could cast a little acorn onto the ground, and a great tree grew up, and he could climb it. So things like this. And this story was a very well established legend within the Native Americans of that region. Would be the Iroquois Confederacy, and the Lenape, the Shawnee, the Iroquois, Mohican, Oneida, all of those, and several others as well. And when the first Jesuit priests or missionaries came, and the first European fur traders, they heard the story. This would have been the 1600s. And of course, they thought it was just a story until, of course, they began to have experiences with it. So these are going to be their experiences. But if you listen to the Native American version, there was accountability for breaking the family up. There was magic given to the children, being that they were innocent, and so they were protected from evil. There was justice and retribution for the husband, who, even though he had justification, had also committed the sin of murder. And when the Americans heard the story, they heard it slightly differently. So it's an interpretation at the beginning. So the settlers heard the story of the rolling head, and they turned it into not a moral lesson about marriage and honesty and honor and innocence, but into a curse. This must only have occurred because a witch had cursed them, and that the woman had become the witch that cursed them. So they often describe the head in colonial accounts as the forest hag or the shaman's trophy. They believe that the Native American sorcerers could detach their own heads to spy on the colonial forts, or that the woman that was murdered was literally murdered for witchcraft, fornication with a snake figure, very much like the Garden of Eden. And that her head could be rolled into a settlement to spoil the milk or sicken the cattle. Now, it might sound silly, but I want you to think about what the 1600s would have been like. These forts sound a lot bigger and badder than they really are. This is literally just usually a stockade made out of wood, and there might be a couple structures inside of it. I have been into some of these old forts that still exist or have been rebuilt based upon the original blueprints. And, this was the only thing that stood between you and death. So they were very afraid. They were afraid of everything. There are encounters of beings supposedly coming in and spying on them, or of things happening because there were, sorcerers among the native people. And I am sure in return there were native people who believed that these people that came here were sorcerers as well. They could do things like, at the beginning, the fire sticks, the muskets, the guns that they had, and what have you. So this was, you could see why they would be afraid that they could detach their heads and roll them inside the grounds and hear their plans and see the layout and be able to come and get them in the middle of the night. But I want to go another step further. What if there was something to this? Not necessarily that these people could roll their heads off their shoulders and into the forts, but listen to this. There are several such of accounts where the a head is involved. So there is one in Lancaster from 1730, and in this account, a group of Scotch-Irish settlers near the Susquehanna River reported seeing a large round shape bounding through the high grass at dusk. Now, the conventional argument, and it's fairly odd to me because I grew up in this area, in Pennsylvania, is that it was an albino badger or a snapping turtle. I have to tell you, snapping turtles aren't usually white. I don't think I've ever seen a white turtle. And badgers, yeah, they could possibly be albino, but it's just kind of a reach. And it said that they were so frightened that they described it in journals as the head of a dead savage seeking his body. So he was looking for what happened to his body. There are others who have described the glowing head going through the swamps along the edges of the river. And both natives and settlers would report a bobbing, glowing head in the marshes. Of course, now the conventional wisdom would be a will-o'-the-wisp, but I have to tell you, a lot of the stories that they like to claim are the will-o'-the-wisp then have been looked into, the Brown Mountain Lights and different others. They're not that. They don't know what it is to this day, but they know it wasn't, that it's not that. That's been ruled out because the swamps have been drained and the the things have been recorded and they don't move like will-o'-the-wisps. There's another one in the 1750s during the French and Indian War where a trophy was taken through decapitation. So basically, one of the young soldiers was killed in battle, and the people that made it back to the fort at Duquesne that night would see colonial records from the fort state that centuries claimed to see the severed head of their comrade rolling towards the gates independently, and that they would see the sight of their friends' remains being displayed by the enemy scouts. So basically what they're claiming in journal entries from the commander and is that that their friend is whole independently up to the gate of the fort as if trying to return, and they would see natives carrying his body, holding his body out and showing it like a trophy. Stuff that makes sense to me about that story, because a lot of times the native people would do something that was horrendous. There's stories in the Lancaster area of a man going out to milk his cow in the morning, and his wife goes out to find him and finds her cooking pot sitting on the ground. She goes to pick it up, thinking, why isn't it on the hook out by the fire? Opens it up, and her husband's head's inside. And there are tons of these stories. I want to make it clear this went both directions. I am not taking sides. So the idea that they would roll his head, but then here's the thing: there's nothing when they go out to get head to procure it so that it's not a trophy. It's gone. The Jesuits were one of the groups of people, the Jesuit missionaries, were one of the primary source documents for the first European accounts of these demonic tales. There are other sources. I got material from a book called The Sketches of 18th Century America, Witchcraft in the American Colonies, and a big nod out to one of my favorite authors, Jeffrey Fraser, who wrote about it in some of the rolling head stories in the Pennsylvania Fireside Ghost Tales, and that he has a whole collection of those. There's like multiple books from him. But I wanted to share that. We thought that was really indigenous legend that then becomes part of the folklore of the local people from different places, whether they were Jesuit priests or what have you. It was something that they began to find it in journal entries and things like that. So that's fascinating. One of the other things I thought was interesting is that they make a point here of saying that the modern horror and pop culture were actually influenced by stories like this, that you can deconstruct the modern like slasher movies, horror movies, things like that, and you'll see that that's still a very powerful and emotional thought. And they where somebody's head falls off or something like that, and they will they use it as great horror, and it's just fascinating to me that it's something that passed from the the 13, 14, 15 years all the way till today, and there's still a version of it living today. So I just found that very interesting. So the next story I wanted to share is called The Inglesby Monster. Now this is a Pennsylvania story as well, although I'm going to take you along through several of the 13 colonies.
I've been there. I've been to Inglesby, and I spent a New Year's Eve there with some friends, hoping to catch a glimpse of the monster, but we didn't. But This was back when we were in high school. Yeah, so it's
Interesting.
been oh yeah, this is one that I've definitely heard of. Yeah.
I have to tell you, I had not, and it's not that far away. It's between Lewisburg
Mm-hmm.
and Tyrone,
Mm-hmm.
on along the railroad tracks there. So from what I understand, it was a little town, a resort town called Inglesby in Center County, Pennsylvania, and it sits in the it was a mountain in the mountains of that area. It was a little mountain settlement, and through the years, they've had multiple encounters with a being. So we're going to visit this mysterious creatures. Basically, what happened is the town died out and became a ghost town because the railroad shut down. And a lot of the little tiny towns that were along the railroad, once the railroad stopped being the important way to travel, um, they ended up dying out. Now they're ghost towns. So the little town of go on to what the Inglesby monster is. So it's in the area called the Seven Mountains in Pennsylvania, just a little thing. In the 1800s, as I said, it was a resort where families came to kind of escape the heat of summer. And it was also a place where people would take the water. We've talked before in other podcasts about how taking the water at one time was really fashionable. In Europe, the rich people would go to places and take the water, meaning they would either bathe in the water or drink the water or both. And there was a doctor by the name of Dr. Frank Barker who had a health retreat there. And there he would, have people come and bathe in the sulfur water, which, by the way, will heal wounds because sulfur heals wounds. So people who were sick would do that. Others would drink from one of the magnesia springs up there. And it became a very popular resort in the 1970s, though, after the railroad died out. As I said, it became just literally a ghost town. But for many of the years that people were there and it was a popular place, people began to talk about things that happened in the woods. They would insist that they saw things. Now, the very first encounter I came up with was from a hunter who had taken a wrong turn near the old railroad grade, and he said that he returned to Colburn, the little town that's still up there, and he was pale and naked, insisting something too tall to be a man, too thin for a bear, in the trees with strange, deliberate grace. Its eyes reflected light like an animal's, but it held an intelligence when it looked at him that froze him in place. Now, other people whispered that the creature wasn't flesh and blood at all, that it was a restless spirit of a murdered man whose death in one of the abandoned houses in Inglesby had not been ever solved. Others claimed that it's a much older story, that it had been um, long ago when the railroad first came through and that civilization was being pushed back. So one of the most enduring stories about the Inglesby creature was told by a group of hikers who camped near the old town. They woke up in the middle of the night to something circling their tents. This would have been after the 1970s, so we're talking 80s, early 90s. Slow, heavy footsteps crunching in the leaves, but never close enough that any of them could see it. At dawn, they found prints in the soft earth, long, narrow impressions that didn't match any known animal. The hikers left Ingleby quickly without looking back. Even today, people who venture to the ghost town sit in the trees chirping along, and all of a sudden you don't hear anything, but they all stop at the same time. That would be a little disconcerting for me. And they say that there's echoes of the old town that linger, but that's not the most important part. It's what is this thing? What is this thing that is still going up and down through the woods of Inglesby? And I wanted to share some stories that I've found collected about it. People talk about it being a mysterious presence. Some of them say they don't see it, you feel it. Others talk about seeing it. Um, I'm going to give you some actual cases where people claim to have seen it. And these are actual narratives of people who were there. So local historians and folklorists have collected the following cases. It is a bipedal creature. Some talk about it as being, it reminds me, you're going to get it right away. I'm curious what you think, of a long, thin gaunt being with a deer's head and horns.
Oh yeah, easily a Wendigo. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
yep,
Mm,
often referred to as a long white being with white buck face and the
mm,
horns. Yeah, immediately. That's
mm,
what I thought. And there are multiple accounts of that being seen. And again, the eye shine, it's very much like the not deer or, or one of those encounters. Just thought it was really interesting that this thing has been seen for just about forever. Now, there are no Native American or stories about it in particular. They don't say like Inglesby, but in that region, there are lots of Wendigo and not deer stories. So that's a very large possibility that what the people saw, and it's very to you and I very close
Well, like I
to where
said,
we live.
having yeah, yeah, having grown up in Belfont, and that's where like I said, it was our senior year, and there were several of us that in two pickup trucks, and it was freezing cold on that New Year's Eve, and we basically drove there, and we sleeping bags in the back of these pickup trucks. They were covered, but yeah, but
Right.
we were we had a fire, and we were just waiting for something to happen, but yeah, nothing ever did.
Yep. People
Mhm,
talk about heavy
mhm,
footsteps in the leaf litter and on the brush crunching around, usually from dusk till dawn. Sudden silences, the entire forest going dead silent all at once. Even the insects stop making sounds. Uh, Unidentified movement noises like branches snapping, something crushing through the brush. Persistent feelings of being watched, even though there's nobody else. In a sense that there is something following you, tracking you. Like you take 3 steps and you hear one extra step and it stops. And some people say they just see a ripple of movement moving through the trees that's long and very narrow. And they think that that's what it is. I found it to be a really interesting story. I have to tell you, this is one of the places I plan to see if I can find this summer.
it's not real easy to get to. Yeah.
I saw they said there's an old dirt road you can take and dust off 4-wheel drive and off we go. So I'm gonna see if I can find it. But I thought it would be worth giving it a shot. So the next story is called Old Scratch of the Wampanoag Fort. The story dates back to 1727, and it is also known as the Tom Walker meets the devil story. Now, it's a fascinating little story, and I thought it was really interesting. Tom Walker supposedly was a man who lived in that area, came to the fort, and he met Old Scratch. Old Scratch, for those who don't know, is another name for the devil. And the site was is still available. You can still get to it. It was a an early colonial story about a real pirate and possibly um, embellished by Washington Irving. So I'm not going to tell you that it's exactly, but this is the best I could come up with. So in the early 1700s, many former Wampanoag sites in Massachusetts had been abandoned or destroyed because of King Philip's War, a devastating conflict that led to the displacement and death of much of the Wampanoag population. Irving situates Tom Walker's encounter in such a place, a decaying native fort deep in the swamps outside of Boston. The swamp was described as dark, treacherous, and half sunk, symbolizing both physical and spiritual decay. Now, the legend is that Captain William Kidd, who was well known in New England in the 1720s, had been executed in 1701, so this would have taken place prior to that, had buried his treasures along the Atlantic coast, including in Massachusetts, in the forest. And in his story, as Irving told it, Kidd supposedly made it with the devil to guard his hoard, leaving it cursed and inaccessible except through a diabolical means. And in 1727, New Englanders began to talk about this fort, this old abandoned fort, and the story that there was a fortune to be had if you could get through and get past Old Scratch himself. So according to the story, local men began looking for it. They found the old fort. There were the rotting embankments, the charred posts, the scattered relics from the past, and they discovered it was completely rotted. So they knew this was the right area. They had the spot. And according to the story, Old Scratch would demand that whoever came to get the treasure um, be a predatory moneylender. They called him an usperer. And that they would have to prey on the desperation of others. Well, this Tom thought he could do it. Tom's like, I can do this. He had no moral concerns about it. He wanted that treasure. He wanted the money. He was greedy. He had an equally greedy wife. And she attempted to make her own bargain, and she would meet a grim fate. But after she died, a grim death, Tom went to the swamp and he called up Old Scratch and he said, I'll seal the pact. If what you want is for me to take advantage of the poor, I can do that. He was already a guy who could do that. In Boston, he was known as ruthless as a businessman. His financial dealings brought him a lot of wealth. But interestingly enough, they never seemed to bring him any peace. His mansion was built, but he never lived in it. It was never even furnished. His horses were thin because he was too greedy to feed them right. And his conscience, well, that whispered to him on long, lonely nights. According to the story, he went out and he agreed to do what he was told to do, and he did do it. And it is said that Scratch, because he was so impressed with how evil Tom was, gave him the treasure, not a penny of which ever brought him comfort or any good. They say that in desperation, Tom took it back and tried to barter it back to Old Scratch himself. Well, no one knows exactly what happened because the treasure, Tom, and Old Scratch seem to have disappeared. So with that, we'll just have to kind of accept that Tom might be out there still arguing with the devil, or the devil might be holding on to the treasure in case Kid comes back for it. After all, Tom brought it back. So I thought that was a really interesting story based on stuff that Washington Irving heard while he was in the United States. And it caught his imagination. Now, our next one is called The Black Dog of Hanging Hills. There is a small and silent black hound dog who is said to roam the Trap Rock ridges of Meriden, Connecticut. An apparition that is known as the Black Dog of Hanging Hills. This creature, whose presence is a blessing and a curse, appears to local people. Now, the legend goes that if you see the dog once, he brings you fortune. If you see him twice, you better hope you don't see him the third time, because the third time he brings you death. The dog never leaves any tracks. Doesn't matter if it's snowing or muddy or what's going on. The dog there's never any sign of it. You never hear him walking or crushing through the leaves. And he will appear, but make sure you've seen him, and then just wink away as though he never were. So I wanted to share this actual encounter. According to the narrative, there was a geologist who was fascinated with the rocks and the ridges of the hanging hills where the dog was seen. He would climb up there with his hammer and his notebook and take little specimens. He believed that the cliffs might have been used by the native people and that the basalt faced dark against the morning sky. And he would climb to the peaks. But on this day, everything was different. He noticed that the air was almost like it was holding its breath, like there was an expectation. He took his most familiar trail that he had climbed multiple times near a place called the West Peak, and a little dog suddenly appeared on the trail. It wagged its tail, and its paws made not a sound, not even its nails clicking on the hard stone. The geologist smiled because the dog felt oddly comforting. It was actually a pretty little creature. When he looked down to jot a note, he looked back up, and although he heard not a sound, the dog was gone. At the time, he thought he was just so engrossed in his note-taking that he must have missed the sound. He didn't really say anything about it when he got back to town. A few months later, he was back there again, and this day he was walking. It was kind of gray and overcast and miserable. He was thinking about some personal issues in his life. And this time he looked up and saw further up the trail the dog. It stopped and sat down as if waiting for him. It did not wag its tail this time. It stared. And then it stood up, stepped behind a boulder, and disappeared. Eventually he mentioned it when he was in town that he had had the strangest experience twice now. And the locals knew exactly what he was about to say. And they said to him, once for joy, twice for sorrow. He laughed and he said, I'm not a man of superstition, I'm a man of science. Of course, I don't believe in foolishness. But a few months go by, and now it is winter, and he decided to climb along the ridge up there and just stretch his legs because, sitting in the house all day in the middle of winter was just very difficult for a man who was always active. So he took off up to the West Peak, and as he rounded a bend, there stood the dog, small and black, ahead of him on the trail. It stopped and looked and wagged its tail. Again, no sound. He called out to it. It did not respond. He smiled. Somehow it felt comforting again. And again, the dog disappeared. He walked up to where the dog had been, and he saw that it was very close to the edge of a cliff. And as he was standing there looking down the side of the mountain, the dog appeared behind him. And for the first time, it made a sound that made him turn. This time the dog's eyes were unreadable. And before he could say anything, the dog stepped up, forward, right up against him, except it vanished. As he was trying to struggle with staying balanced because he had thought the dog would hit him, he lost his footing. His fall was swift and final. There were no tracks but his own whenever he was found. It was believed by the locals that he saw the dog the third time, mostly because in the notes it said, the dog is here again. And then he wrote some more notes, and that seems to have been right before he passed away. The dog became a legend in the mountains. And to this day, there are people who go up there looking to see if they can find it, but only once. Once you see it the first time, you definitely don't want to see it again. And I just thought it was a really interesting story. There are other such stories, kind of tales of animals or beings that bring kind of an ambivalence. One time they bless you, the next time they don't. And we're going to go on to a story. It's called The Woods Devil of Coos County. Now, long before there were settlers, the Abenaki people talked about a creature called the Musasasmak, the thin ones. They were described as tall and possibly slender. These beings lived between the trees, slipping through the forest like shadows. They were not spirits exactly. They weren't animals. They weren't people. They were something in between. They were watchers. They kept to the deep woods and avoided human contact. The Abenaki believed the thin ones were the guardians of the forest's balance. They appeared only when the woods were threatened or when someone wandered too far into places where humans were not meant to go. When the European settlers arrived in the early 1800s, they took axes and saws and they were hungry for timber. And they also brought fear, fear of the unknown, fear of the wilderness, fear of the darkness, the fear of the forest of Coos County. Now, Coos County was vast and unbroken then, stretching for miles, without a cabin or a road. And the men who worked the logging camps reported things, strange things, feelings of being watched, glimpses of movement flashing through the trees, tall, thin shapes, not human, not animal, vanishing the moment you looked at them directly. At first, the settlers dismissed the sightings and called them tricks of light, results of exhaustion. But the stories grew, and now one logger claimed that he saw a figure, thin as a sapling and gray as old bark, step behind a tree and disappear. Another swore he heard footsteps pacing him through the woods, though there was no one there when he turned. A hunter from Stark told of shooting at a deer only to see a tall, pale shape rise up from behind a spruce and glide away without a sound. By the 19th century, the legend had taken on a new name, the Woods Devils. The Woods Devils were said to be 7 to 9 feet tall, with limbs like poles and skin the color of weathered wood. They moved with uncanny speed, slipping behind a tree so quickly that a person could blink and lose them. They never attacked. They never spoke. They never made a sound. They left no tracks. They simply watched. Some believed that they were the remnants of old people who had adapted to the forest so completely that they became a part of it. Others thought they were the spirits that were angered by the destruction of the woods. Few whispered that they were neither human nor spirit, but something that the forest had brought to life to help shape itself. Now, in 1901, there was a surveyor by the name of Elias Turner who vanished for 3 days near a river up there. When he stumbled back into the camp, exhausted, half frozen, he claimed to have been followed by stick men who kept just out of sight. He said they never harmed him, but they herded him gently but firmly away from the ravine he hadn't noticed. And when he returned later with a team, they found the ravine had collapsed, leaving a deep pit, a sinkhole, where he would have fallen. Turner insisted that the Woods Devils had saved his life. Others said that he had simply been lucky. But the story, it took on a life of its own, and through the 20th century, sightings continued, especially among hunters and hikers in the remote forest. Most describe the same thing, tall, thin figure, blended perfectly with the trees, watching silently before slipping away. Skeptics call it optical illusions, pareidolia, nature's eeriness of the dense woods. But believers, well, they point to the consistency of the description throughout generations and people who did not know until after they had had an experience. And as the forest thinned and the roads got cut deeper into Coos County, the sightings have become more rare. Some say the Woods Devils retreated further into the north, into the untouched wilderness. Others say they have simply grown tired of being seen and have learned to hide even better. But every so often, a hunter in Pittsburgh or a hiker on the Kilkenny Rail Ridge Trails reports a flicker of movement, something tall, something thin, something that disappears the moment it's noticed. And then the old stories, they begin again. The Abenaki elders still say the thin ones are guardians. They're not monsters. The settlers' descendants still tell stories around campfires of the Woods Devils who watch from the trees. And the forests of Coos County remain deep, ancient, and filled with shadows. Shadows that sometimes just seem a little too tall, a little too narrow, and a little too much alive. Now, some will tell you the Woods Devils are gone, but others will say they were never meant to be seen in the first place. A few walking alone in the North Woods swear they can still feel their eyes upon them, patient, silent, and older than the time itself. And if you want, you can delve into the folklore. You can read the other historical accounts. But the forest of Coos County has a long memory, and the Abenaki who walked it then, settlers, the men who carved roads through it, the loggers who cut deep into its heart. For all of them, the stories are true. For the hikers, the hunters, those who wander in there today and have a sighting, well, they'll tell you there is something in there, something that's been watching from the very beginning, and it's watching still. It means no harm, but they say it's a little sadder because the trees have been felled and the land has been tamed. And in order for them to find peace, the watchers, the woods devils, they have to go further and further away from the land that they love and the forest that they mourn. Hope you enjoyed that story. It's one of my favorites I found. And I would like to share with you a few other sightings. In 1939, there was a deer hunter who had an encounter near Pittsburgh. He saw a tall, thin figure rise from behind a spruce. He thought it was another hunter, but he said it was over 8 feet tall. Its limbs were impossibly long. Its skin was gray and bark-like, and it stepped behind a tree and vanished. He said he quit hunting that day. There was a snowmobile chase in 1964 where two teenagers were riding a snowmobile near the Canadian border when they reported a stick man running alongside them at an impossible speed before darting into the trees. Their story made the local paper. The sheriff dismissed it as overactive imaginations. The boys clung to the story. There was a highway watcher in 1978. A trucker was driving Route 3 at night. He saw a tall, thin figure standing perfectly still at the tree line. And when his headlights hit it, it broke. It turned sideways, ran into the woods, and disappeared. Its body so narrow, it simply slipped out of sight. In 2004, a hiker was walking through the Coos Trail and he snapped a picture of what he thought was a moose in the distance. When he zoomed in later, it's a tall, thin figure standing upright behind a tree. The photo circulated briefly online before skeptics said it was an optical illusion. The hiker insists that he saw nothing that day. A wildlife biologist in 2011 was studying the moose population and reported seeing a large, elongated gray figure watching her in the trees, at least 7 feet tall, extremely thin, motionless, and blending perfectly with the bark. When she raised her binoculars, it stepped behind a tree and seemed to disappear. She left at that moment. In 2019, a trail cam near the Connecticut lakes captured a single frame of a tall, narrow silhouette between two pines. In the next frame, taken literally 1 second later, it was gone. No blur, no movement, no tracks. Hunters still argue about this image. Local forums and hiking groups continue to talk about it from 2022 to 2025. There have been reports of tall shapes watching from the tree line, sudden silences in the woods, the feeling of being followed, and something that stepped behind trees too quickly to be human. One hiker wrote in the forum, "It wasn't Bigfoot, it was too thin, too tall, too quiet, and it didn't run, it slid behind the trees." So the legend lives on, and there are a lot of sightings. I literally only chose a small handful, but I'd like to leave this last one. Now, I gave you all the sightings in order, but I saved this one for last. This is the testimony of a girl from Stark, New Hampshire, 1949. She was interviewed by the state police after being found unharmed. She had been lost in the woods. This is what she told them. "I got turned around in the woods and I cried a lot. Then a tall, thin man came. He was skinny like a stick and he didn't talk, but he pointed for me to follow. He walked funny, sideways sometimes, like he was hiding behind trees even when there weren't any. He led me to a trail. When I turned to thank him, he was gone. The officers dismissed the little girl's story as imagination, but the young girl would insist well into adulthood that this is what happened to her. What do you think?
Oh, that sounds perfectly reasonable. I mean, yeah, how many of us have experienced things as children? Of course, we are dismissed because we're children, you know. But these stories, or this particular one, I really like this one though, because they don't seem to be bad at all.
No, they're not bad. They just seem to be
Hmm.
guardians of the forest.
And yeah, out of
And
all
it
the
is.
other stories you've told that make me want to just stay out of the woods, this one makes me want to go back in. So there is some balance.
There is balance, yeah. And whatever this thing is, it seems helpful. It seems
Hmm.
kind-hearted. There's multiple accounts of it saving people from harm. Had this thing not appeared to her and motioned for her to come with it, she wouldn't have found the trail. Had the other person, not, taken heed of what it was trying to tell him, it would have fallen down into the area where the sinkhole opened up. And there are many such stories. It's a really interesting tale. And this is what I wanted to talk about tonight because I'm going to do a second part to this. There's some more great stories like this. These stories start out in the 15 and 1600s with native people and in arrogance, and also just ignorance sometimes. And I don't mean that in a rude way. Like if you don't know something, then you're ignorant of it. People
Yeah.
came and they heard the native stories and they laughed at them and they said, oh, they're superstitious. But they're not. They simply were describing it the best way they knew how to describe it, to say this is what's going on there as well. And the validation of these first person accounts of the Abenaki, seeing them in multiple states, as you can tell.
Hmm.
We covered from Pittsburgh all the way up to, through the New Hampshire area. And further on, we could go as well. They're beings of the woods. And this one's my favorite one of all, because I've had those moments where I'm sitting alone in the woods and all of a sudden everything just stops. And you're like, you feel like something shifted and you have this heightened sense of like what's going on and anticipating something and you're looking around. And it's almost like the woods take a deep breath. And then all of a sudden you'll hear the tweeting of a bird, the caw of a crow, crack of little bit of something stepping in the brush, and you're wondering for just a moment, is that a deer? Is it a wild animal? Is it, well, now I'm going to wonder if it's one of the woods devils, the watchers, the thin ones. And if it is, I don't think I'd be at all afraid because they sound like they're lovely beings, elementals of some sort, from what I would guess, tasked with being the tenders of the forest. And you know what? All around the world, there are stories of something along the same lines. Different names, different descriptions to some extent. But I believe that there are beings out there that were tasked with caring for the woods. I believe they're saddened when the woods are cut to pieces. I believe that the scars we leave behind matter. There's a story from Pennsylvania. It's called the One Tree House. And there were trees in Pennsylvania large enough to build a house which was 2 stories high and had 4 rooms in it. One tree. We look in awe at the redwoods in the West Coast. We had them too, not redwoods, but trees that large. Trees that people would hollow out a section of and live inside of, 8 by 10 rooms inside of the tree. We don't know what we've lost because of that relentless grinding toward being more urban. I'm not a person for the urban world. I think that cities are evil, intrinsically evil. They do terrible things emotionally, mentally, spiritually to humans. that the idea of being surrounded by concrete and feeling nothing but concrete under my feet, to me, is more horrifying than being ripped apart by a wolf. It makes me cry. I've had that moment standing in New York City, and I started to bawl. My friend who was with me, she's like, "Why are you crying?" And I said, "Because the trees are dying. They're sucking in this smoke, this exhaust, and they're so sad." I love this story, and I'm really glad I got to share it with all of you. And I want to thank you all for coming and visit with us every week. And I want to tell you that you're a blessing because I count you as family. And Stu and I are really grateful that you come and listen. And I try really hard to find good stories. And boy, do I have a few more to tell. So for tonight, good night.